July 18th, 1944. The air inside the command post of the 1st United States Army was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy, suffocating weight of impending disaster. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood before a large situation map pinned to the wall, his eyes scanning the casualty reports that had just arrived from the front lines. It was a grim ritual. 6 weeks had passed since the euphoric landings of D-Day. 6 weeks of what was supposed to be a liberation campaign had turned into a slaughterhouse. The reports told a story of brutal, grinding attrition in the Norman hedgerows. 6 weeks of American soldiers dying in narrow, sunken lanes between ancient stone walls and earthen banks overgrown with vegetation so thick, so impenetrable, that a man couldn't see 10 yards ahead of his own rifle barrel. Bradley's First Army had suffered over 40,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing in action. The numbers were staggering, a hemorrhage of manpower that threatened to bleed the American army dry before they even reached the Seine. They were stuck, bogged down in terrain that made every field a fortress and every hedgerow a killing ground. The Germans were fighting with the desperation of men who knew the war was coming to their doorstep. But as Bradley knew all too well, the ferocity of the German defense was only half the equation. The Germans weren't the only problem. The real problem, the strategic cancer eating away at the Allied invasion, lay 6 miles to the east, in the ancient city of Caen. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, had promised to capture Caen on D-Day. He had looked Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower in the eye and sworn that British forces would take this critical road junction within hours of landing. He had promised to push inland immediately, securing the open plains south of the city to give the Allies the desperate room they needed to maneuver. 6 weeks later, Caen was still in German hands. The city had become a symbol of broken promises. Montgomery's entire army group was stuck outside a city he had promised to take on the evening of June 6th. Because Montgomery was stuck, the strategic balance of the entire invasion had shifted disastrously. The Germans, realizing the British were stalled, were able to concentrate their armored reserves against the Americans. Every panzer division that wasn't fighting the British was killing Americans in the hedgerows. Bradley looked at the casualty reports again, his jaw tightening. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, school teachers from New York. They were dying in the mud of France because Montgomery had failed to deliver on his guarantee. And what made the bile rise in Bradley's throat was that Montgomery was now claiming his failure had been the plan all along. This is the untold story of how Montgomery's broken promise at Caen nearly destroyed the Normandy invasion. It is the story of how American soldiers paid in blood for British failure, and how the brash, unstoppable genius of George S. Patton had to save D-Day from a disaster that Montgomery refused to admit even existed. To understand the magnitude of this failure, we must look back at the blueprint of the invasion itself. Operation Overlord was developed over 18 grueling months of planning. It was to be the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. The division of labor was clear. British and Canadian forces would land on the eastern beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, with the city of Caen as their primary, non-negotiable objective. Caen was critical. It was the linchpin of Normandy. It was a major road junction connecting the invasion beaches to Paris and the interior of France. More importantly, beyond the city lay open, flat terrain. It was perfect country for tank warfare, the kind of ground where the Allies could use their numerical superiority in armor to crush the Wehrmacht. If the Allies captured Caen quickly, they could push inland, threaten Paris, and prevent the Germans from containing the invasion force on the coast. Montgomery had been explicit. He promised Eisenhower he would take Caen on D-Day, not on D+1, not within a week. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944. The plan dictated that British forces would secure the city by nightfall and push south toward Falaise within days. Meanwhile, American forces would land on Utah and Omaha beaches to the west, tasked with capturing the Cotentin Peninsula and the deep-water port of Cherbourg. While Cherbourg was critical for logistics, it was considered secondary to Montgomery's push inland from Caen. The entire Overlord plan depended on speed. Allied intelligence knew that formidable German panzer divisions were stationed in France. If the Allies got stuck on the beaches, the panzers would counterattack and drive them into the sea. Montgomery had to break inland fast to preempt this response. Montgomery assured everyone, Churchill, Eisenhower, and his own staff, that he understood the stakes. He would not fail. Caen would fall on D-Day, and the breakout would begin immediately. June 6th, 1944, the longest day. British and Canadian forces stormed ashore on the eastern beaches. Despite the terror of the moment, the landings were largely successful. Casualties in the British sector were lighter than the catastrophic predictions. By mid-morning, thousands of troops were moving inland toward Caen with high morale. The British 3rd Infantry Division pushed south from Sword Beach. Their objective was clear: Caen, just 6 miles inland. At that moment, the door was open. The terrain was clear. The Germans had minimal forces in position to stop a determined thrust. The path to Caen was vulnerable. But here, Montgomery's plan revealed a fatal flaw. He had prioritized logistical caution over operational speed. Instead of racing for the city while the Germans were disorganized, British forces paused. They stopped to consolidate their beachhead. They waited for heavy artillery to be landed. They organized supply lines before advancing further. They were being cautious when the situation demanded reckless aggression. Every minute of delay was a gift to the enemy. By the afternoon, German reinforcements were arriving. The 21st Panzer Division, a veteran unit, counterattacked in the gap between the British and Canadian sectors. They didn't have the strength to push the Allies back to the beaches, but they succeeded in doing something far worse. They stopped the advance toward Caen cold. By nightfall on June 6th, British forces were digging in, still 3 miles from the city limits. Montgomery's promise was already broken. Caen had not fallen on D-Day. Initially, Montgomery didn't seem concerned. He projected an air of supreme confidence, telling Eisenhower the delay was merely temporary. British forces would resume the advance the next morning, he claimed. Caen would fall within days, but the window of opportunity had slammed shut. June 7th came and went. British forces attacked toward Caen and were stopped by hardening German defenses. June 8th, the same result. June 9th, still stuck. The Germans were rushing panzer divisions to Normandy from all over France, and every one of them was being sent to stop the British at Caen. By June 10th, 4 days after D-Day, the reality was setting in. Montgomery's plan had failed. Caen was not going to fall quickly. The British were stuck in a grinding, static battle on the approaches to the city. The open terrain Montgomery had promised to capture was firmly in German hands. The British were stuck, and because they were stuck, the American nightmare was about to begin. At German headquarters in France, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox, was making a critical decision that would shape the battle for weeks to come. Rommel had limited panzer divisions to defend against the massive Allied invasion. He had to decide where to concentrate his armor. It was a choice between two evils: focus on the British sector at Caen in the east or the American sector in the west. The British intentions were obvious. Montgomery's constant, albeit failed, attacks made it clear they were trying to take Caen. If the British broke through there, they would have a straight shot to Paris. The terrain was hard, dry, and flat, perfect for tanks. They could drive deep into France and collapse the entire German front. On the other hand, the Americans in the western sector were entering the bocage, the Norman hedgerows. Rommel knew this terrain intimately. It was a nightmare for armored warfare. It consisted of small, irregular fields separated by ancient earthen banks, some 4 feet high, topped with thick, tangled hedges and ancient trees. These were surrounded by narrow, sunken lanes. Every field was a natural fortress, every lane a trap. Rommel calculated that he didn't need tanks to stop the Americans there. Infantry could hold the bocage indefinitely. Rommel made his choice. He would concentrate his panzers against the British at Caen. The 21st Panzer Division was already there. He ordered the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to the city. Then the Panzer Lehr Division, an elite unit. The 1st SS Panzer Division followed. These were Germany's best units, equipped with the newest Panther and Tiger tanks. By mid-June, 7 German panzer divisions were concentrated in a tight ring around Caen. Over 500 heavy tanks. These were the very divisions that could have counterattacked the American beaches. They could have crushed Bradley's forces while they were still consolidating. Instead, they were all fighting Montgomery. This situation was exactly what Montgomery would later claim he intended. In his memoirs, he would argue that he deliberately attracted German armor to his front to hold it in place, acting as a magnet so the Americans could break out. But the historical record tells a different story. In June 1944, Montgomery wasn't claiming this was a holding action. He was attacking Caen repeatedly, trying desperately to break through. The British were fighting with immense courage, but they simply couldn't break through a wall of 7 panzer divisions. While Montgomery fought his stalemate at Caen, American soldiers were dying in a different kind of hell. The bocage was a terrain unlike anything the American army had ever trained for. These weren't garden hedges like one might find in the English countryside. These were centuries-old fortifications, the roots so thick and gnarled they could stop a 30-ton tank in its tracks. When a Sherman tank tried to climb over the embankment, its nose would rise, exposing its thin, vulnerable underbelly to the sky, a perfect target for a German anti-tank shell. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, turned every hedgerow into a slaughterhouse. They placed MG-42 machine guns to cover the narrow lanes between fields, creating overlapping fields of fire. They positioned mortars in defilade where Americans couldn't see them or hit them. They mined the approaches and waited. American infantry had to attack across open fields toward hedgerows they couldn't see through. German machine guns cut them down before they could even close the distance. If they miraculously made it to the hedgerow, Germans on the other side would simply throw grenades over the top. If the Americans breached one hedgerow, there was another one 100 yards away, and another, and another. American tanks were rendered nearly useless. The narrow lanes forced them into single file, where the lead tank could be knocked out, trapping the entire column. The Germans used Panzerfaust's portable anti-tank weapons to destroy Shermans from hiding positions within the thick vegetation. The bocage effectively neutralized the American advantages in armor and air power. The casualty rate was horrifying. Companies lost 50% of their strength in days. Regiments were decimated, attacking objectives measured in mere hundreds of yards. Divisions suffered thousands of casualties for gains measured in single miles. The First Army was being ground down in the worst fighting American forces had seen in the European theater. Bradley understood exactly what was happening. His soldiers were paying the price for Montgomery's failure at Caen. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the front would have opened up. The Germans would have been forced to spread out. Americans could have maneuvered in open terrain instead of being trapped in the claustrophobic death trap of the bocage. Instead, the Germans could afford to concentrate their best armor against the British because they knew Montgomery wasn't going anywhere. They could put experienced infantry against the Americans and make every yard costly. By early July, American casualties exceeded 40,000. Nearly one-third of Bradley's assault divisions were casualties. Replacements were arriving, but they were green, inexperienced boys. They died learning lessons that wouldn't have been necessary if Montgomery had kept his promise. Pressure was mounting. On June 26, 1944, Montgomery launched Operation Epsom. 3 British divisions attacked west of Caen, attempting to encircle the city. Montgomery committed his reserves. This was supposed to be the decisive push that finally broke the German defenses. The British attacked with massive artillery support. Hundreds of guns fired preparatory barrages. Infantry advanced behind creeping barrages, a wall of exploding steel. Tanks followed in support. It looked like overwhelming force. It should have worked. But the Germans were dug in and ready. The same panzer divisions that had stopped previous attacks stopped this one. German Tiger and Panther tanks engaged British armor at long range, their superior optics and guns decimating the British ranks. German infantry held their positions with fanatical resolve. The British advance measured progress in hundreds of yards per day. By June 30th, Operation Epsom had failed. British forces had pushed a salient across the Odon River, known as the Scottish Corridor, but they couldn't exploit it. German counterattacks threatened to cut off the advance. Montgomery ordered his forces to dig in and consolidate their positions. Caen was still in German hands. 3 weeks had passed, and the primary D-Day objective remained an impregnable fortress. Montgomery's excuses were wearing thin. In London, Winston Churchill was furious. British newspapers were openly questioning Montgomery's competence. The Americans were getting restless. Eisenhower met with Montgomery on July 1st. The meeting was tense, the air thick with unsaid accusations. Eisenhower demanded to know when Caen would fall and when the British would finally break through. The Americans couldn't stay trapped in the bocage forever. Bradley's divisions were being destroyed by inches. Montgomery, ever the showman, promised another offensive. This one, he assured Eisenhower, would be even bigger. He would use heavy bombers to carpet bomb German positions, turning the defenders to dust. British armor would smash through an overwhelming force. He called it Operation Goodwood. It would begin in mid-July. This time, he swore, he would not fail. Eisenhower had heard this before, but he felt he had no choice. He approved Goodwood. The alternative was to admit the Normandy campaign was stalemated, a political disaster the alliance could not afford. July 18th, 1944. The same day, Bradley was reading his casualty reports with despair. Operation Goodwood began with the largest air bombardment in support of ground operations the Allies had yet conducted. The sky turned black with planes. Over 2,000 bombers dropped 7,000 tons of high explosives on German positions east of Caen. The earth shook for miles. The bombing devastated German forward positions, turning villages into craters and tanks into scrap metal. As the smoke cleared, 3 British armored divisions moved forward. Over 700 tanks roared across the landscape. This was the breakthrough. Finally, after 6 weeks of stalling, Montgomery had the overwhelming force to crush the resistance. The British tanks advanced through the moonscape of the bombed area. They made good progress initially. For a few hours, it looked like success. Montgomery sent optimistic reports to Eisenhower. The breakthrough was happening. The Germans were retreating. Then, the trap sprung. German forces that hadn't been hit by the bombing positioned in depth, further back than the Allies anticipated, counterattacked. Deadly 88mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed for anti-tank warfare and hidden in stone villages, opened fire. They destroyed British tanks at long range with terrifying accuracy. German panzers that had survived the bombing moved into hull-down defensive positions. The British armor ran straight into a killing zone. By the end of July 18th, the British advance had stalled completely. They had gained a few miles but hadn't broken through the German line. The German defenses bent but did not break. Over the next 2 days, the British lost over 400 tanks trying to push forward a catastrophic loss of equipment. Operation Goodwood was grinding to a bloody halt. Montgomery called off the offensive on July 20th. In a move that stunned his American allies, he claimed it had been a success. British forces had captured the ruins of eastern Caen and inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans. He portrayed Goodwood as a strategic victory. But Eisenhower knew the truth. Goodwood had failed to break through. The British had lost 400 tanks and suffered 5,000 casualties for a few miles of devastated ground. Montgomery had promised a breakthrough into open country. He had delivered another costly stalemate. Churchill was so angry he almost fired Montgomery on the spot. Only intervention from the British military leadership prevented a change in command, but Montgomery's credibility with Eisenhower was gone. The British were not going to break through at Caen. 6 weeks after D-Day, that fact was undeniably clear. If the deadlock was to be broken, the Americans would have to do it themselves. After Goodwood failed, Montgomery began telling a new story, a narrative revision that would persist for decades. He claimed he hadn't been trying to break through at Caen at all. His real objective, he argued, had been to hold German armor in place. Every panzer fighting the British was a panzer that couldn't fight the Americans. Montgomery claimed this attrition was his plan all along. From before D-Day, he said, he had intended to draw German forces to the British sector. The attacks on Caen weren't failures. They were deliberate attritional battles designed to fix German attention while Americans prepared their breakout. This was a lie, a convenient, politically necessary lie, but a lie nonetheless. Montgomery's planning documents from before D-Day proved it. His orders to subordinate commanders proved it. His promises to Eisenhower about taking Caen on D-Day proved it. He had intended to break through, and he had failed. Now he was claiming failure had been the plan, but the Americans who fought in Normandy knew better. Bradley knew. Patton knew. The American generals understood exactly what had happened. Montgomery had failed to deliver what he promised. American soldiers paid the price in the hedgerows. Montgomery was now claiming credit for a strategy he had been forced into by his own inability to gain ground. The lie was politically brilliant. It protected Montgomery's reputation and allowed the British to maintain the fiction that Montgomery was successfully executing a master plan. Eisenhower, prioritizing the unity of the Allied command, accepted Montgomery's new narrative outwardly while privately planning to sideline him. The Americans would break out. Montgomery could claim whatever he wanted afterward, as long as the war was won. Bradley had been planning the American breakout for weeks. He realized he couldn't wait for Montgomery anymore. If the Americans were going to escape the bloody maze of the bocage, they would have to do it themselves, without British support. The plan was codenamed Operation Cobra. Bradley would concentrate the First Army for a massive, focused assault near the town of St. Lo. Heavy bombers would be used differently this time. They would carpet bomb a narrow strip of the German line. American forces would punch through the weakened defenses and exploit into the open country beyond. Bradley had one critical advantage. The Germans were still concentrating against Montgomery. 7 panzer divisions remained fixed at Caen. The German infantry facing the Americans were good soldiers, but they were depleted and, crucially, they lacked heavy armor support. If Bradley could break their lines, there was open country beyond. Bradley had one other advantage, born of American ingenuity. While the generals were arguing over maps, American soldiers were improvising in the field. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen realized that the German steel obstacles from the beaches could be cut up and welded onto the front of Sherman tanks. They called them Rhino tanks. These modified tanks didn't try to climb the hedges. The steel tusks cut right through the earth and vegetation, allowing the tank to burst through the hedgerow with its guns level and ready to fire. American ingenuity was ready to do what British planning couldn't: conquer the terrain. The key to Cobra was speed. Once American forces broke through, they had to move fast, faster than the Germans could react. They had to exploit the breach before the Germans could shift panzers from Caen to block them. This required aggressive exploitation. It required a commander who wouldn't stop to consolidate, someone who would keep advancing until ordered to halt. Bradley had exactly the right general waiting in the wings: George S. Patton. Patton was America's most aggressive combat commander. He was the general who had raced Montgomery to Messina in Sicily and won. He understood mobile warfare better than anyone in the American army. He was flamboyant, controversial, and utterly ruthless. Patton's Third Army was officially activated on August 1st, 1944. But Patton had been in Normandy since mid-July, secretly planning the exploitation phase of Cobra. He had studied the maps. He knew exactly where he would go once the breakthrough happened. Eisenhower gave Bradley operational control of American forces. Montgomery would command the British, but he would no longer control American operations. Bradley could execute Cobra when ready. If it succeeded, Patton would lead the breakout. The Americans were going to finish what Montgomery had promised to do 7 weeks earlier. July 25th, 1944. Operation Cobra began. The earth shook as over 1,500 heavy bombers and 400 medium bombers attacked German positions near St. Lo. They dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs on a narrow 4-mile-wide strip of the front line. The bombing was devastating, though not without tragedy. Short drops killed over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. But on the German side, it was an apocalypse. The Panzer-Lehr Division, which had been moved to face the Americans, was effectively annihilated. Tanks were flipped over like toys. Infantrymen were buried alive in their foxholes. Communications broke down completely. Survivors were stunned, wandering in a daze, their eardrums shattered. American infantry attacked immediately after the bombing. The 7th Corps under Major General J. Lawton Collins pushed through the cratered moon-like landscape. German resistance was sporadic and disorganized. The line was broken. By the evening of July 25th, American forces had penetrated the German defenses. July 26th and 27th saw the breakthrough widen. More American divisions poured through the gap. German attempts to counterattack failed miserably due to confusion and lack of communications. The entire German defensive position in western Normandy was collapsing. Bradley committed his reserves to exploit the success. On July 28th, American forces finally broke into open country. They were beyond the bocage, beyond the hedgerows. They were in tank country. This was the kind of terrain where American armor and air power could dominate. This was the kind of breakthrough Montgomery had promised to achieve at Caen 6 weeks earlier. The Germans frantically tried to rush reinforcements from Brittany to plug the gap, but they couldn't shift the bulk of their panzers from Caen. Montgomery's attacks, failures though they had been in gaining ground, had indeed fixed the German armor in place. The Germans were paralyzed, unable to respond to Bradley's breakthrough with their best divisions because they were still terrified of a British breakthrough at Caen. By July 31st, American forces were pouring through the St. Lo Gap like a flood. The Normandy stalemate was broken. After 6 weeks of grinding, bloody combat, The Americans had done what Montgomery couldn't do. They had broken out, and George Patton was about to make Montgomery look even worse. Augustunust, omieno sute patrus et shipatru. Patton's Third Army became operational. His mission was to exploit the Cobra breakthrough. Initially, the plan called for him to swing west into Brittany to capture the ports. Then he would reorganize for future operations. But Patton looked at the strategic situation and immediately understood that the plan was obsolete. The German army in Normandy was broken. Their defenses were collapsing. The path east was wide open. Ports in Brittany didn't matter if the war could be won before they were needed. Patton made a command decision that would change the course of the war. He would send one corps to Brittany to fulfill the letter of his orders, but the rest of the Third Army, the bulk of his force, would go east, toward Paris, toward the German border. He would exploit the German collapse until he ran out of gas or got new orders to stop. Bradley understood what Patton was doing and quietly approved. Eisenhower was informed only after Patton was already moving. By the time anyone could countermand the orders, the Third Army was advancing so fast it would be impossible to stop them. Patton's divisions moved faster than any army had moved in the history of modern warfare. They covered 50 miles in days, then 100 miles, then 200. They bypassed resistance, leaving it for follow-up units, and kept driving deep into the enemy rear. They liberated French towns so quickly that German defenders were caught completely by surprise. French citizens woke up to find American tanks rolling through their streets before the Germans had even finished packing. The Germans tried to retreat in order, but Patton kept cutting them off. His armor moved faster than German infantry could march. His cavalry reconnaissance found gaps and exploited them before the Germans could establish new defensive lines. By mid-August, the Third Army had advanced further in 2 weeks than British forces had advanced in 2 months. Patton had gone from Normandy to the Seine River. He had done in 14 days what Montgomery had promised to do on D-Day, and still hadn't accomplished 6 weeks later. Montgomery responded to this dazzling American success by claiming credit for it. He told the British media that the American breakout had succeeded solely because he had held the German armor at Caen. He argued that he had created the conditions for American success. According to him, Bradley and Patton were merely executing Montgomery's master plan. American generals were furious. Patton had succeeded times despite Montgomery, not because of him. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the breakout would have happened in June, not August. Thousands of American casualties in the bocage were Montgomery's responsibility. The delay had cost lives. After the war, Allied intelligence interrogated surviving German generals who had fought in Normandy. Their testimony revealed the absolute truth about Montgomery's claims. General Hans Eberbach, who commanded Panzer Group West at Caen, gave extensive testimony to U.S. Army historians after his capture. He stated unequivocally that the Germans concentrated their panzers at Caen because that was where the British were attacking. The German defense was dictated by the ferocity of the British attacks, not by some clever British deception plan. The Germans were holding at Caen because they couldn't afford to lose the position. If the British broke through, the war in France was lost. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer-Lehr Division gave similar testimony. He said the British attacks at Caen were serious, full-scale breakthrough attempts. Operation Goodwood, he noted, particularly convinced the Germans that the British were trying to break out. The massive bombing and tank assault was clearly meant to shatter German defenses, not just distract them. None of the German generals believed Montgomery was deliberately holding them in place. They believed he was trying desperately to break through and failing. Their decisions to concentrate panzers at Caen were responses to real, existential threats, not reactions to a feint. When asked about the American breakout at St. Lo, German generals admitted they had been surprised by its success. They had expected the Americans to grind forward slowly, yard by yard, as they had in the hedgerows. The sheer speed of Cobra and Patton's exploitation caught them completely unprepared. The German testimony destroyed Montgomery's post-war narrative. He hadn't been conducting a brilliant deception operation. He had been trying to break through at Caen and failing repeatedly. The Germans had concentrated against him because he was attacking, not because they were being fooled. American success came despite Montgomery's failures, not because of his genius. The numbers tell the story that official histories often tried to obscure. The First U.S. Army suffered over 62,000 casualties in Normandy, 20,000 killed in action, the rest wounded or missing. These were casualties incurred largely while fighting in the Bocage, while Montgomery was stuck at Caen. How many of those casualties were preventable? How many American soldiers died because Montgomery failed to break through and open up the front? The question is impossible to answer precisely, but the strategic analysis is clear. If Montgomery had taken Caen on D-Day as promised, the Allies would have had room to maneuver. American forces wouldn't have been trapped in the Bocage for 6 weeks. The breakthrough would have come in June, not late July. The casualties would have been significantly lower. German generals confirmed this assessment. They stated that if Caen had fallen quickly, they couldn't have held the Allies in Normandy. The entire defensive strategy depended on holding Caen and keeping the Allies contained. Montgomery's failure to take Caen allowed that strategy to work for nearly 2 months. The casualty exchange rate in the Bocage was horrific. American divisions lost 30 to 50% of their infantry strength in the first weeks. Companies were rebuilt multiple times. In the Bocage, the attrition rate for riflemen was nearly 90% in some units. It got so bad that by July, the U.S. Army was facing a crisis of manpower. Cooks, clerks, and mechanics were being handed rifles and sent to the front lines to fill the gaps left by the dead. The 7th Corps alone suffered 11,000 casualties in July during the fighting leading up to Cobra. Every one of those casualties has a name. Everyone has a family that received a War Department telegram. Everyone paid the price for the delay. Patton's breakout reduced casualties by restoring mobility. Once American forces broke into open country, the casualty rate dropped precipitously. Mobile warfare favored the side with air superiority and superior logistics the Americans. The Bocage had favored the defenders, and Montgomery had trapped Americans in the Bocage for 6 weeks. The contrast was stark. Montgomery promised to take Caen on D-Day and failed after 6 weeks of effort. Patton broke out of Normandy and advanced 250 miles in 3 weeks. One general was cautious, methodical, and failed to meet his objectives. The other was aggressive, opportunistic, and succeeded beyond all expectations. The Normandy campaign succeeded despite Montgomery, not because of him. American soldiers broke through where British forces had failed. American armor exploited where British forces had stalled. American aggression won the campaign that British caution nearly lost. Montgomery's promise that he would take Caen on D-Day was the foundation of the Overlord Plan. When that promise broke, the entire campaign had to be rebuilt around American success. Bradley and Patton delivered what Montgomery couldn't. That is the hard truth history tried to forget. Montgomery failed at Normandy. Patton saved D-Day. And American soldiers paid the ultimate price for British incompetence.